Have you ever noticed how our bodies often become the center of attention in religious spaces, even when the message is supposed to be about God? Christianity claims to be one of the more progressive religions, especially after Jesus, when it comes to protecting women's rights. But I do find myself wondering, why does it still seem to fall so short when it comes to protecting women's autonomy? I think it is worth looking back at the norms that existed in the formative years of Christianity to really understand where some of this comes from. I mean, many of the laws in Deuteronomy around assault were deeply shaped by a patriarchal legal system where men held the primary authority and women's rights were limited. But while some of these laws seem like attempts to protect women, they do raise difficult questions when you look closely at them. For example, there is a law in Deuteronomy that if a man slept with an engaged woman in a city and she didn't cry for help, both of them would be put to death. But I'm wondering, what if he covered her mouth? What if she froze or went into shock? What if she lost consciousness? I think about how easily such a law that was designed to protect women could end up putting the victim in even more danger. Another one that really stays with me is that if a man slept with an unbetrothed virgin, he was required to marry her and he could never divorce her. On the surface, it does look like protection, but if you sit with that for a moment, being bound for life to someone who violated you, imagine that. The burden of sexual immorality so often fell on women, even when she was the one who was harmed. Now, there is a lot of nuance that needs to be applied here, okay? Women at the time were economically dependent, first on their families and then on their husbands, and laws like these existed to protect women in that case. Family honor was tied to reproductive integrity, and because things like inheritance and social standing, the context really does matter. There is still a pattern worth noticing, and I'll be honest, I don't fully understand the complexities behind why these laws existed, but there does seem to be a recurrent theme of women's bodies being treated as something shameful and untouchable. And I think that history gives us insight onto why certain attitudes still show up in the modern Christian space. I do want to be fair. Every institution has a dress code, and dress codes serve a purpose. You wouldn't necessarily push back against a reasonable workplace dress code if it made sense and it helped create the right environment. But I do find myself asking, why does it seem to land so much harder on women when it comes to the church? Why does clothing determine whether the message is worth hearing or not? Why do the clothes conclude everything about the character of the person before you even give them a chance? And something that personally stands out to me is that, well, I'm African and a lot of African traditional clothing looks like this. In many African cultures, these clothes are considered perfectly respectable and appropriate. And that makes me wonder how deeply colonization must have shaped how we consider what is modest and appropriate. Not just how we see ourselves as Africans, but how we relate to our own body. And something that personally stands out to me is that, well, I'm African and a lot of African traditional clothing looks like this. In many African cultures, these clothes are considered perfectly respectable and appropriate. And that makes me wonder how deeply colonization must have shaped how we consider what is modest and appropriate. Not just how we see ourselves as Africans, but how we relate to our own bodies. When missionaries came to Africa, they conflated Christianity with European cultural values. Covering the body wasn't just about modesty, it was framed as becoming civilized. So African dress became associated with paganism and shame, not just immodesty, and that's a distinction worth making. Colonization didn't just change what Africans wore, it changed how we felt about our bodies. There's a difference between choosing modesty and being taught that your natural body is something to be hidden and ashamed of. That's internalized shame, and it's still being passed down in churches today, often by Africans ourselves. Many African churches are now arguably stricter about dress codes than Western churches, enforcing standards that were originally imposed on their ancestors. The colonized became the enforcers. This is part of what makes Jesus' relationship with women so striking. He consistently moved against cultural norms. One of my favorite examples is the encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well. He not only spoke to her, which was culturally unusual, but he revealed his identity to her, and that's significant. This woman was considered an outcast in her community. She had been married multiple times and was living with somebody who was not her husband. He could have easily chosen somebody with more social standing, likely a man, who would have been seen as a more credible witness at the time, but he chose her. He also pushed back against moral policing in a direct way. In John 8, when a woman was caught in adultery and was brought before him, he said that whoever was without sin should cast the first stone. And one by one, everyone walked away. He didn't shame her. He just redirected the focus to the personal accountability that was everyone's, not just hers. It's worth remembering that enforcement of laws around adultery wasn't always equal between men and women. Jesus refused to participate in this one-sided judgment. And I think that it's worth sitting with when we think about how these conversations play out today. So I find myself coming back to the question, why does a woman's clothing so often determine the level of respect she receives? Why, when that same standard isn't equally applied to men? Which makes me wonder, do we actually have a problem with the clothes, or do we have the problem with the body wearing the clothes? Are we genuinely concerned about modesty, or is this about controlling women? People are quick to quote 1 Timothy 2 verse 9 when it comes to how women should dress, but Matthew 5, 29, 30 is quoted far less when looking at someone with lust is treated as seriously as the act itself. If we're genuinely concerned about purity, that feels like a conversation worth having too. I don't think it's easy to answer these questions, but I do think they are important to look into, because a faith that holds women to standards that doesn't equally apply to men makes women feel like their bodies are the problem, and it's going to struggle to make women feel truly seen and welcome. Anyway, it was lovely having you here. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments, and I'd really love to hear what you think and what you have to say. I'll see you in the next one.